Hello, everybody, and welcome back from lunch. We should be live here, but let me know with maybe some emojis or sound off in the chat. Great to see we've already got some Q&A questions rolling in even before the session has started. Means people are as excited as I am. Let me know if you can see me. Let me know if you can hear me. Anything in the chat, any emojis flying through, all of those things would be super, super cool. And I'll hop into it really quickly here. Perfect. Looks like we're live. Welcome back. Hope you all had a good lunch. Hope you all got some water in you. Hydration is super important when we're staring at our screens all day, every day, at least for these few days of TMF week 2023. Super excited about this afternoon session. Before we hop into it, just want to really quickly go over some housekeeping. Yes, 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 all sessions will be recorded and available at the end of the day. Yes, you will receive a certificate of attendance, but it will be for the entire conference, not per session. So look out for that in your inbox toward the end of the week. Questions are going to be answered at the end of the presentation in the Q&A period from 1:30 to 1:45. That said, if Christina does accidentally go over a little bit, she has committed to showing up in the lounges after, which is super exciting. Just wanted to give you all a little bit of a map to the lounges because it seems some people have maybe been struggling to get there. At the top of the website, if you will, the platform that we're on, where you've been hitting agenda and then scrolling down through the list of all of the presentations to find the one you joined, like the one you just joined a couple minutes ago. To the right of that, or maybe two to the right of that, there should be a tab that reads Lounge. Click on that, you'll come to a page that looks like a bird's eye view of some rooms with some chairs. Click on one of the chairs and you'll actually plop yourself into a chair. You can turn your camera and mic on or not, totally up to you. And you can chat with everyone else who's in that room. So it's sort of like a little bit of a virtual, not virtual hybrid situation. It's pretty cool. Definitely check it out. And yeah, that's the networking break that is on this slide here as well. Like I said, 30-minute presentation, 15 minutes for Q&A, maybe, hopefully. If not, we'll see y'all in the lounge. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you all to Christina Monastero and the presentation on 360-degree inspection readiness. Just gonna pull my presentation here, and Christina, take it away.
All right, let's hope I can get this right. Let me see. Uh-oh, that's not what I want. Of course this would happen. I had it right from when I tried it out. Let me see if I can get this again.
You got it.
Am I sharing? Ah,
sharing.
All right. No IT snags. So first, thank you, Montrium, for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here and certainly really excited to speak about inspections. And thank you to everybody who's dialed in for the presentation. I really appreciate it. I know people are super busy, so I really appreciate folks, dialing in and giving me some of their time to talk about inspections. So for those of you that I haven't met before, I am Christina Monastero. I'm the Associate Director of Clinical Document Management, or TMF, at Larimar Therapeutics. I have been in the industry, I think it's going on 14 years now, and have worked across large, mid-size, and small pharmaceutical and biotech organizations. So both in drugs and biologics development. The bulk of my experience is really around TMF, so the TMF business processes and the systems. But anyone who has worked with me in the past knows that I'm really passionate about that from the aspect of clinical quality, compliance, and inspection readiness. So big cheerleader for inspection readiness and trying to think about how we can implement that as we go through our studies. I know a lot of us from the TMF side, we're really interested in the TMF because the TMF is sort of like all of these giant puzzle pieces that we try to piece together to make a story of our trial. And inspections really are just about our ability to do that. So to kind of put things together and to evaluate what we've done on the trial. So my goal for today isn't just to educate you on inspections and sort of what they are and what the scope is, but also to challenge all of you on the line to really start thinking about inspection readiness and where you can build it into your day-to-day. All right, so this is just the general disclaimer that tells you that everything in this presentation is my views. It shouldn't be attributed to Montrium, who's had me here today, the organization I'm employed by, or any organization to which I'm affiliated with. Okay, so before we get into talking about inspection readiness, I do want to take a couple moments just to talk about inspections and sort of set the foundation for anybody who hasn't been through these before. So what is an inspection? So ICH GCP defines an inspection as the act by a regulatory authority or authorities of conducting an official review of documents, facilities, records, and any other resources deemed by the authority or authorities to be related to the clinical trial, and that may be located at the site of the trial, at the sponsor or CRO's facilities, or any other establishments deemed appropriate by the regulatory authorities. So today we're going to specifically focus on clinical or GCP inspections, but there are other types of inspections that can occur. So for example, somebody can come in and inspect our manufacturing processes, or they may look at things like your drug safety process. But for today, we're really going to focus sort of just on the clinical side of inspections. And inspections also can be, they can be for cause, or they can be triggered inspections, or they could be routine. So things like a for cause inspection might be something that's associated with safety, for example, like safety surveillance, or a breach in the UK. Anything that would be a routine inspection would be like the things you would think about for associated with a routine inspection program, so conducted at a certain frequency. Or associated with something like a marketing application submission. So any of those inspections that would occur prior to, so a pre-approval inspection is what they call it. So prior to approving a product. So that is sort of going to be our focus for today. And I am just going to speak generally from the perspective of the sponsor and sponsor inspection. So some of this you can sort of apply from the vendor side, but I'm not really going to get into anything around the site perspective. So some examples of inspecting agencies. So there's a lot of regulatory authorities, and this is certainly not an all-inclusive list, but I think these are probably some names that you're probably heard of or familiar with, some of the bigger agencies that we hear about. So in Canada, we have Health Canada. In Japan, there's PMDA. The European Union, there's EMA. MHRA in the UK, and in the United States, we have the US FDA. So just to note that inspections can occur at anywhere you conduct your study. So regulatory authorities, they're not limited to conducting inspections in the regions of their jurisdiction. So we just want to think about, as you develop studies and you're talking about what your study specific processes are going to be, we want to make sure that we take into account the perspectives of the different regulatory authorities in the regions that we're operating in. Okay, so what is the purpose of an inspection? So an inspection is really an independent assessment by a regulatory authority inspector to kind of gauge three things. So first is to evaluate the safety, rights, and well-being of study participants in our trial. Second is to verify the quality and the integrity of the data that we generate during the trial and the data that goes into what we submit to regulatory authorities. And the third is to assess our compliance with our protocol, any applicable regulatory requirements in those regions we're operating in, and our study-specific business processes. So this is your cross-functional SOPs and processes. So as we think about when we develop processes around inspection readiness, we want to make sure we kind of hit these buckets. So being able to make sure we've protected subjects, making sure we have processes around data integrity, and making sure we're compliant with all the processes on our study. Okay, so what can you get looked at during inspection? So there's a lot of things that inspections can really focus on, and sometimes they can vary. But these are generally sort of areas that people are going to inspect around. So the first is organizations, personnel, and qualifications. So they are all of the organizations that support your study. So us as the sponsor, as well as any vendors you might outsource work to, and qualifications of study personnel. So things like your CVs, your job descriptions, training records, all of that is stuff that gets looked at during inspection. The inspector may want to look at our quality management system, so including things like our SOPs, how do we implement SOPs, how do we develop SOPs, Selection and management of outsourced services. So these are all your external service provider vendors. So the processes around how we select vendors, what do we have in place for vendor oversight and vendor management, things like your contracts with vendors, what have you delegated, work to in those contracts, things like the Toro. And also just a reminder that as ICH requires us from the sponsor side, we need to make sure that we also understand that this extends to all of our vendors, even if you do not subcontract or you do not contract them directly and they're subcontracted through a third party like your clinical CRO. Study management is another focus area. So all of the documents that kind of, guide how we run our trials. So things like the protocol that give us information about our study, the investigator brochure that talks about the product we're using, and anything that's subject facing. So for example, informed consent, as well as other processes around submitting and getting the right approvals by regulatory authorities, by ethics committees. Processes like clinical trial insurance are covered under there. Feasibility, site selection, and monitoring. So how did we conduct feasibility? How did we select sites? What is the monitoring process, both from the SOPs and the procedures around medical as well as clinical monitoring? How do we qualify and train CRAs? How do we manage things like protocol deviations, safety and pharmacovigilance? So how do we manage adverse events? What is the reconciliation process between the clinical and the safety database? How do we report out and distribute safety reports to investigators? What are the reporting timelines? Have we met them? Data collection, management, and the sources of data. So everything that sort of falls under this bucket, in your data management plan, identifying the sources of clinical data that we have, making sure that we have processes around how we manage them. What are the systems that are used to collect data, making sure that we can get access to some of those systems if they're requested, so EDC, or if you have things like eCOA or ePro, making sure that we have robust processes around our data management, and then how do we report that out, and what's the interaction with statistics is also a part of that. Statistics is statistical analysis of our clinical data, and that includes things like how we evaluate our clinical data with protocol deviations, any trial committees that you have. So if you have an IDM, an independent data monitoring committee, or a safety monitoring committee, what are the processes around how that committee operates? Have we done things like financial disclosure evaluation on people who sit on those committees? And how do we share clinical data with them for review? Investigational products. So a lot of times you'll see a big focus on things like IP accountability. So making sure that we can kind of end to end show what's happened to our drug throughout the study. Processes we may have with like IP issues. So anything around product recalls, for example, would fall under that bucket. What are the processes for administering or handling investigational product? And then last but not least, the TMF. So what are the sources of TMF content? So we may have an electronic TMF, and we may have some of our TMF documents managed in there. We may have other TMF documents that are managed in places like your safety database, for example, or an EDC system during your study. So identifying where all of the content is, what format is it in, and what processes do we have around managing it. Okay, so I know it's a little weird to have a time for a poll, but before we kind of kick off inspection readiness, I did want to sort of take a gauge from the audience how many have actually been involved in a regulatory inspection in the past. So this can be in any capacity, whether you've supported from like a front room or a back room perspective, or if you've just been involved in, say, like I've been involved in preparing lots of studies for inspection and they've never gotten inspected, but we've put the work into, preparing for it. So in any capacity, if you could just use the voting, I'm going to see if I can actually do this on my end. Oh, it's live. Great. Okay. So if you could just go into the poll section and vote if you've been involved or haven't been involved in any regulatory authority inspections in the past. Oh, interesting. We've got a good mix. It looks like maybe 3/4 of people so far have been involved. And 1/4 haven't yet. So this is great. Okay. All right, I'll give that another couple seconds. And then I will see if I can figure out how to end it. All right. Let me see. I don't know. Can we see? Is that on the screen? I can't tell. I guess not. So it looks like 75% of the people in the session have been involved in a regulatory inspection. So congratulations. And about 25 haven't. So we'll talk a little bit, more about some of the background information of the inspection as we go through. Okay. So follow-up question related to this is, for those of you who have, so the 75% that said they have been involved in an inspection in the past, what agencies have you been inspected by? So just to note, this is, you can only select one. So if you have more than one agency inspection that you've been a part of, feel free to add that into chat. So the options here, we have FDA, MHRA, EMA, Health Canada, and PMDA, which is Japan. But if there's any others that you've been involved in, feel free to kind of add those into the chat as well. And then for those who have been involved in inspection by different agencies, just if you could add, let me see, did I mess up the polls? Okay, looks like people are voting, so I'm hoping I got that right. If you've been through inspection by more than one agency, if you want to put any details in the chat, I'm curious how people think about if one inspection by one agency felt similar to or different than inspection by another agency. Wow, a lot of you have been through great inspections. A lot of people who have been through FDA, almost half of our respondents. So that's interesting. Okay. And then anybody who has been through inspection by several agencies, if you can indicate in the chat if they felt similar to or different than one another. So for example, if FDA or MHRA inspections felt the same, or if they felt any different. Okay. All right, I'm going to end the poll. We are at, looks like we have a bunch of people have voted. 44 votes. Okay, so about half of the people who voted have been through FDA inspection, about 10% MHRA, 13% EMA, 15% Health Canada. Sorry, I know you guys, I can't figure out how to share that with you, so I'll just read it aloud. 2% have been through PMDA, and then 9% have had other. So, and it looks like the people in chat are indicating that they weren't similar. They felt very different. So that's great. That's where this is going to segue me into our next slide. Okay. So thank you all for your feedback. So as folks have indicated in chat, while the intent or the purpose of inspections are the same, the way that inspections are conducted across agencies really varies greatly. So inspections are not a one-size-fits-all approach. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail, but they really vary depending on the agency that you're being inspected by. So for example, you may get requests for documentation ahead of inspection or agendas. Some agencies don't, and they come in and they just want to see it as they're there. Sometimes you get notice, other times you don't get very much notice. So there really are a lot of great differences between the different agencies. So the best course of action if you're preparing for a specific agency inspection is certainly to familiarize yourself with that agency's practices and their tools. There is a lot that's online to really help people. So things like, so most of my experience over the last couple of years is with FDA, and most of you probably know that FDA has sort of a playbook for how they conduct inspections that we refer to as the BIMO manual. So tools like that, EMA and MHRA have similar resources online that kind of show you what the scope and some of the intent of the inspection will be, and help you really design processes around, a specific agency inspection. We want to also make sure that our inspection management processes are really robust and consider agency differences. So it is not a good idea to focus your inspection management procedures on one agency, because they all kind of operate in different ways. So we want to make sure that as we think about how we conduct inspections and the processes we have in place for that, that we're really flexible and taking into account the points of view of different regulatory authorities. And then certainly the last bullet, and I can't emphasize this enough, is understanding that the inspection landscape is really continuously evolving, and so must we. So we really have to make sure that we have the technology and the infrastructure to be able to adapt to those changes, because I think certainly things like COVID, joint inspections that agencies are conducting together, decentralized trials, and the move to more technology-based, methods. A lot of stuff is really changing. Regulations are changing. So we really need to make sure that we're adaptable and we can continuously evolve with those. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about inspection readiness now. So we hear this term used a lot. It's used in many different contexts, but like, what is inspection readiness? So inspection readiness is not an activity that's associated with an end of study milestone, like you've locked your database or you're getting ready to finalize your clinical study report. It is really a continuous and ongoing state of being, and it begins as we develop our protocol, and it continues even after we finalize our study report. So it's not really a one-time end of study event. It is something that's kind of continuous throughout our study. Inspection readiness requires proactive, not reactive activities. So we want to make sure we're kind of managing things in real time as they're occurring. And certainly you don't need necessarily a dedicated inspection readiness person to sit on your study, but you do need commitment from each function to ensuring that the processes that we have in place are compliant, they're high quality, and in making sure that the output of those processes, so what we evidence as a part of that, is also high quality as well. And we want to make sure also that we implement, proactive quality and risk management phases, risk management practices throughout all phases of our trial. So we're really identifying and managing risks and issues as they occur. You do not want to wait till the end of the study, because you cannot fix anything by that point. So it's really important we're kind of identifying these and managing them in real time. And then just to note, I think sometimes I hear people say this, but quality in clinical trials is everybody's responsibility. It is not solely a QA responsibility. It is all of our responsibilities to make sure that, the business units that we have are managing their deliverables with high quality expectations. And then think with the end in mind. That's really important. So, as we go through our study, we want to make sure, like, the things you do today, think about how that's going to impact us down the line, and not even just necessarily getting through. Maybe you're planning a submission and you think, oh, I'll get inspected shortly after. But I always tell people, think about retention periods, right? So we have, a lot of us are bound by these 25-year retention periods where we may have to manage our documentation for 25 years. And you might not be here anymore. We may send it off and forget about the trial. And 24 years from now, somebody comes in and decides to take a peek through it. We want to make sure that all of the documentation that we have there can really still tell that story, and that story is still there's no gaps and there's no pieces, and somebody's able to kind of inspect it from the third party perspective, just coming in, looking out, and being able to see what we've done on our trial. So that's really important. Always, always, always think with the end in mind, not just like, what am I doing right now, but what is this going to look like down the line? Okay, so what are some activities of what can support us from an inspection readiness standpoint? So first and foremost, an audit program. We want to make sure that we audit our processes. We want to make sure that we audit our systems. We want to do vendor audits. We want to make sure we audit our sites. Functional document reviews, so TMF reviews cross-functionally by those people who are responsible for those pieces of the TMF. We want to make sure that we have ongoing processes for that. And these reviews really should be assessing that we have complied with the regulations we're required to comply with. So again, based on where we're operating our studies, as well as the SOPs and plans that we have in place. So that's really the big piece when I talk about TMF review. It's more like, have we done what we're supposed to do, and less about things like Alcoa and stuff like that, though that is still important. Dry running your inspection procedures. So certainly, you know, inspections can happen at any time. You may not get an unannounced inspection. It may be less likely than, you know, one that would be planned, but it can happen. So we just want to make sure that our team members are really trained. They understand inspection procedures. They understand what their roles would be if we were to get inspected. And they have the tools to be able to kind of support that. So dry running those from time to time is really great to do. And I would say, like, especially in the challenging landscape now that we have of, we're not just dealing with on-site inspections anymore. Now we deal with remote. Sometimes we deal with hybrid. So how do you manage that, right? There's like technology implications and things in there as well. So we want to make sure that we're prepared for everything as those come up. And certainly if I could like break down what an inspection really is, it would be this block here, knowing your SOPs and your study plans and where you've deviated. This is really the critical piece. When they come in for an inspection, they are looking at, what is your process? Let me see evidence of that process. So we want to make sure like all of our functions should really be able to speak to their SOPs. They should know them like the back of their hand. We should know our processes, and we should also understand where we've deviated and be ready to speak to how we've documented that. We talked a little bit about this, but risk identification and issue management, making sure that we're doing that throughout the study. Certainly there's no expectations that we're not going to have issues that come up in our study, right? It's not realistic, but the important part is that we can identify them and we can put processes in place to figure out how we're going to manage them. So maybe it's something minor and you think, oh, I can document this with a note to file, or it's something that seems more systemic and it requires a CAPA, but we want to make sure we have processes around managing those, and that we're doing it continuously, you know, throughout the study. Waiting until the end of the study to find this stuff doesn't really give us any time to correct anything. And certainly, like, you don't want to walk into an inspection room and have somebody tell you something that you should have known the entire time if you had better oversight. So risk management and issue identification is very important. Management of inspection readiness tools. So a lot of these you probably already do at the study team level. You may have things like your study team roster. You may have logs that help you track study documents. You may have reports out of Argus that tell you all the safety events that have happened on a specific study. We want to make sure we manage that stuff in real time, because it really helps us to be able to understand what happened on our study, you know, the documents that we have in place, and sort of pooling everything together when you're preparing for an inspection. It's great to have those tools. Flow charts, diagrams, and storyboards. So these, you know, I think lots of times we hear storyboards and we think, oh, this is kind of an end of study activity that we prepare when we're starting for inspection, but get in the habit of thinking like, let's write storyboards as issues occur, because things happen over time. We forget, processes change, somebody leaves the study. So we lose a lot of information. So it's really important we're actually like figuring out how we're going to document that as we go. And flow charts and diagrams, if you don't have these already as a part of like what's in your study plan. So for example, sometimes a data management plan may have a data flow diagram. These are really great tools to help people understand processes and to break down complicated processes, so our team members feel more comfortable understanding, you know, what the process is on a study, and being able to kind of understand who's all impacted and what are the touch points of those processes. And then regulatory intelligence. Oh, our landscape is changing very quickly. So it is really important to keep up to date with this stuff. It is hard sometimes because there's a lot of it. And like, I sign up for the notifications on different websites. So I'll get things that say, well, this draft guidance came out and this webinar is there. As much as you can keep up to date with the regulatory intelligence, it's really great because things are changing. You know, we need to be up to date on what's changing. We need to understand the impacts, and we need to be ready. So, it's really like R3 is a good example. It's coming. Are we ready? Have we thought about what it means for us? So just start to think about that stuff and, you know, how we're going to apply it down the line. Okay, so I've just put, this is certainly not, you know, an all-inclusive list, and you may have things within your organization you've used, but I just put together an example of some inspection readiness tools I've used in the past. So the first is an inspection readiness checklist or a workbook. I'll show you an example of one I've done. These are really focused on a specific agency and sort of the focus areas around how you prepare, but can also help us like as a project management tool. So you could build things like this into like Microsoft Teams, or you can build it into Smartsheet and kind of use it as a tool to be able to manage some of those inspection deliverables. Cross-functional SOP log and any deviations to your SOPs. So remember, SOPs are not just your organization's SOPs, they are your study's SOPs. So that is also your vendor's SOPs. And we want them current and historic. So it's not just what are we doing today, it is what have we done throughout the study. So we want to make sure we keep track of that. We understand what processes we had in place in our study, and we want to understand the audience, like, so who's in scope for training, or who does that impact? A list of IT systems. So the computer systems you use on the trial, we want to make sure we understand the business processes we have around those IT systems. So a lot of your IT SOPs, for example, and things like computer systems validation. So eTMF, EDC, all of those GXP systems that require specific processes around how we manage them. You want to make sure you have all the documentation for go live. You want to make sure you have all the documentation for any releases you've done, and you understand like the process for change management and anything that's changed. So pooling all of that into one place is a good tool. List of study documents and plans. So just understanding what study documents did we have on our study. So things like versions of protocols, investigator brochures, anything that's kind of subject facing, and things like plans. So what plans did we have? What's the change between one version of a plan and another? Did we comply with those plans? So making sure we have all that kind of centrally in one place really saves a lot of time later. Team training records. So training and qualification is a huge focus of inspectors, certainly. So we want to make sure that we understand, who is required to train on what training items. So for example, I have somebody that just joined my study and they are managing my study. They probably need to train on my protocol. They might need to train on my IB. They might need to train on my project management plan. So putting together a training matrix to identify, what are the different roles we have on the study, and based on, the content of some of those documents, or things like plans where they're expected to take action in a process, identifying who needs to train on those, and then making sure we have all that together. So training is a big focus. Sometimes we manage it in different places. So you may have a learning management system internally that manages things like your SOP training, and you may manage some of your other training records in the eTMF. So maybe I attended an IM and said that I was trained on these processes because I was at the IM. Making sure we have sort of a list of where everybody's trained helps you really easily pull those records together later if you need to. Study team roster. So everybody who has supported your study across, organizations, start and stop dates, make sure you have their role, not just their title, because sometimes it's not clear what somebody's doing on a study when you just have their title, and things like start and stop dates, contact information. And then of course, all of those people, we should make sure we have CVs for, we have job descriptions for, all of the, qualification records for those folks. Vendor list. So what vendors supported your study? What are the dates that they worked on your study? What services are they contracted to perform? Do we have all the contracts for those vendors? So we want to make sure, like, there's a lot of things to think about as we talk about vendors. Decision logs. Some of you may manage these in meeting materials. I see a lot of teams typically do this, but it is really helpful to have a decision log that's sort of a standalone decision log, because it helps you remember those key activities on your study and sort of what the output of that was. So if you have to, it's a good training tool to have to kind of brief yourself on key pieces of the trial, rather than going and having to dig through all of your, the meeting minutes for your study and try to recreate that later. And last, your TMF index or document locator tool. So a lot of us use the index for this purpose. So I don't know if anybody's using anything else at this stage, but if you look at the CDISC reference model, a lot of us add columns and we say, where does the document live? So that kind of gives us an inventory of here's what we have, and these are the systems or the locations that those documents are in. So we want to make sure we have that, because it's really important you're clear with the inspector on what content we have and where that content is. So this is just a quick example of a checklist I did for FDA preparation. So if you look at, I don't know how easy this is to see on the screen, but if you look at these columns here, this is all directly from the BIMO manual. So you can actually see it's got the page number, the section title, and then their inspectional focus. So a lot of these, if you read them, you can see it will tell you specifically what the FDA is going to ask for and what they're going to do. So like these are related to determining overall organization of people involved in studies. So maybe your organizational charts or your roster kind of support that. And then we've built in some columns to actually look at our processes and say, okay, well, if FDA is looking for this, what do we have that shows that? And this is really sort of what we would be, provide during inspection. And then you can also add other things in. So like activities around certain things. For example, if I have study team training records, well, I want to make sure I reconcile them, right, for all my key roles. Or if I have a roster, I want to make sure all the personnel are there. So I got to reconcile that. CVs, I have to make sure I have all versions of them for different people during the trial. So you may decide to add in like certain activities if you don't have them covered elsewhere. And things like a responsible functional area. So like who's actually managing this piece of the process, which helps you from a project management side. And then there's some other things I've added in here, but certainly you can manage them in different places. But just an example of something you can do to kind of help you prepare for, one specific agency. Okay, so I added a slide on storyboards because I thought these were important to talk about. And actually, somebody had brought this up in a presentation I sat in yesterday. So I thought maybe I'll tie this in a little bit. So storyboards really are a great tool for us to kind of do three things. So one is to help us speak to complicated processes. So to better understand these, to assist team members with understanding and recalling key aspects of our trial, or what probably most of us are familiar with storyboards for, to address non-compliance issues. So if we're not compliant with our SOPs or regulations, how do we tell the story around what we did? So there was a discussion yesterday around sort of what the format of a storyboard would look like if you were writing a non-compliant storyboard. So I did add some areas like I would put in a storyboard, for example. So around non-compliance, identifying what your problem statement is, what's the background around the issue, what impact did it have to your study, what did we do to address it, what is the strategy to address during inspection. So we're either going to proactively address it or we're going to wait for somebody to ask it and then we'll address it then. And any associated documentation. So making sure we can quickly pull things together to show what we've done. Storyboards are really, really, really a great tool to help us align on messaging or our story. And I will say these really help people feel confident going out into a front room. Certainly none of us feels great when we have to go out and speak to an issue that came up. But knowing like your take home messages around it and making sure we can clearly convey what we've done to the inspector, I think makes people a lot more confident. So key issues or management of key aspects of the trial are really good for storyboards. And then just like I said earlier, create these on an ongoing basis. Don't wait till the end of the study. You risk a lot of loss of history and it's really, really hard to reconstruct things, especially if you have stuff in email and you're digging through email inboxes, trying to figure out where you said something and who sent what. So definitely try to create these as these issues occur. Okay, and it wouldn't be a TMF conference if I didn't speak a little bit about TMF and how it ties into inspection readiness. So I think if you all attended Paul's opening yesterday, you may have heard something similar to what I'm going to say. And certainly if you've worked with me in the past, you've heard me go on a soapbox about this several times. But I do want to talk a little bit about the TMF and inspection readiness. So while inspections encompass several areas outside of the TMF is really the source for records during an inspection. And the records in the TMF should aim to tell the complete story of the trial. So inspectors expect that everything is in one place. There shouldn't be any gaps. They can logically follow it and they shouldn't really have to ask you any questions. So everything, the complete story is there. So we need to ensure that as a part of being able to do that, we have robust oversight of the TMF. So we need checks in place to review the content of the eTMF for completeness. So for example, have I filed everything according to my study plans and SOPs, as well as ongoing management of the content itself in the TMF. So like workflows and things like that. We don't want stuff sitting around. It's got to be processed according to timelines, and we want to make sure we're actioning certain things. So as a part of thinking about inspection readiness in the TMF, we want to make sure we consider two different kinds of reviews. So first is like the document level review, which a lot of us associate with data integrity, good documentation practices, and this ALCOA acronym that we always see, as well as our cross-functional reviews to assess compliance with study plans and SOPs. So there's kind of two pieces here. A lot of times I go to conferences and I only hear people talk about document level review, and maybe because most of those folks are sort of TMF people, but just to get the message across that, you know, that stuff is sort of low hanging fruit compared to like not having entire processes followed. So we want to make sure we're addressing both aspects of that. And avoid the misconception that your eTMF system is going to do it all for you. It really won't. It doesn't replace the need for people to go in and conduct manual reviews of their documentation. So I think we got that message yesterday, and I'm hoping folks kind of understand that this TMF completeness is sort of a myth sometimes, and there's a lot of pitfalls. And we just need to be prepared to understand, like, we need to manage some things on our end as well. So the limitations and strengths of the TMF, eTMF system can really help teams understand most documents that are supposed to be in the TMF and can provide some information about those documents. So for example, the reference model has some great fields on like alternate names. So one company calls it this, my company calls it that. Definition, so helping you understand like what's the business process that's associated with this and what other things might be there. The eTMF can help you sort of understand most of the stuff that should be there because it's designed off what we expect to see across industry, right? So a lot of that's there, but there's certainly uniqueness when we talk about working with different companies that do things in different ways.
Hey, Christina, just wanted to pop in for a minute and let you know there's 5 minutes left.
Oh no! All right. Ugh, okay. Thank you. Sorry, I get too wordy. See. Okay, so they can assist with high-level QC of things like Alcoa, can measure compliance with timelines in SOPs or plans, such as contemporaneousness. But the eTMF is really dependent on the information you give it. So garbage in, garbage out. If you don't manage things like expected documents as they're going, you know, as they're changing during the study, if you don't account for study-specific information, such as all these new vendors I'm working with, or these new regions I'm working in, you know, a lot of that really doesn't do much for you. So the take-home message here is an eTMF does not replace the need for manual reviews of documentation by SMEs. Okay, oh boy, I'm going to try to get through this in 5 minutes. And so, so let's talk a little bit about inspection preparation. So I hear this interchangeably with inspection readiness, and it's not the same thing. So I do want to kind of differentiate. Inspection readiness, it's proactive, we implement it early, it's ongoing, it's continuous. Inspection preparation is more triggered, it's related to something like we've submitted or we have an announcement around an inspection, and it includes processes around the management of the inspection itself. So we want to recommend starting 9 to 12 months before submission. And if you're planning to do a mock inspection, you want to do that 3 to 6 months prior to your submission. So just make sure you kind of align those timelines there. In terms of inspection planning, a couple different things we want to think of: develop a project plan, make sure it clarifies the scope, the activities, who's involved, what are their roles and responsibilities, and the project timelines. Consider any vendors, especially if you're working with vendor systems like EDC or IRT, any of the sites. Ensure dedicated project management resource. This is very important. Keep things on track. There's a lot of functions to manage, and certainly there's a lot of deliverables. So you want to make sure you have somebody who's kind of reeling that in and herding the cats and everything's on track. Inspection readiness checklist. We kind of looked at one of these, so I won't go over that again. But just to talk about inspection tools, we talked about some examples of them, but also make sure you consider the tools you use for inspection. So your contact list, your presentations, things like that. And then training. So any sponsor, vendor, site training as you see fit, mock inspections, great training materials. And make sure you use the hats on, hats off method, which really helps folks a lot with training. Okay, so I think I have like 8 slides left. I'm really running low on time. So do we have any option to continue to go, or does this cut me off in 2 minutes? I mean,
we can go over by a few minutes, but the next session will still start at 2, and it would be great to get some time in the lounge with you for some of these awesome questions we've got.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about inspection management. So anybody who attended this session earlier probably already got this, but regulatory authorities have different processes around inspection notification. You may get notice. It might be a day, you may get a couple months. They may ask for things like ahead of the inspection. So for example, a dossier, they may not give you an agenda. They may just come in and start looking at what they look at. we want to make sure that as we're moving to this virtual world, that we're also considering system access. So system access is a big thing. And we heard this yesterday from somebody, and I've heard it from others. Sometimes inspectors will ask for access outside of their inspection dates, and it could be months before they're supposed to inspect. So if that is the case, you need to make sure you have good processes in place for how you're going to manage that, because that is certainly adds another layer of complexity to the inspection. Number of inspectors that can show up can vary. You could get 1, you get 5. I mean, it could be a team. And the duration of the inspection. Maybe they're there for a week. Maybe they sit at your place for a month. So we want to make sure our inspection management procedures consider these differences and allow for adaptation. So remote, hybrid, on-site inspections are great examples. We have front rooms, back rooms. How do we manage that with technology? Who's impacted? What roles do we have? We still have scribes. We still have hosts. We still have runners. What are the tools we use? Scribe notes, request logs. Personnel availability. So if you have internal and external folks you're working with, we want to make sure we understand their availability, put processes in place if you're working with vendors to give them a heads up and to clarify expectations on, any requests. Consider regions and time zones, and certainly nobody works on just one project, right? So you're probably working on other studies, and we need to make sure we clarify with people what the expectations are. And then certainly supporting technology and equipment. A lot of this changes, so we need to make sure we're ready for everything. This is the agenda of a typical inspection. I'm not going to cover this in detail. Just to talk about requests, document requests and review. Extremely important that we clearly communicate with inspectors potential sources of documents. They need to know where it is. They need to know what systems they have access to. So the system type, the type of access they would need, make sure your training is brief. They do not have a lot of patience to sit through training that they've done at several other places already on the same systems. But also kind of balance if training is short, what resources do we have to help them should they get stuck on something? So, a quick reference card, training slides, things like that are great. You can hand them off and they can kind of navigate on their own. And then if they want your support, they can ask for it. Prepare your cross-functional teams to manage requests. This is so important. Consider back room and front room. Okay, so your inspector doesn't always want a TMF person like me sitting in the front room, and you probably don't if you're a function, because there's a risk I could show them something you don't want me to show them if they ask for it. Like, show me meeting minutes, and I happen to produce the one meeting we had this major issue. So we really want to get functions into the habit of actually going and into the documents, pulling their own documents and being able to kind of show them either guided access or, from a background perspective, just going and pulling the document. Consider how long it takes to find and produce the request. How do we provide the request? So is it the source document? Is it a PDF rendition? And what expectations do we have for QC? So maybe only applicable to the back room, because if you're in a front room, you're not doing anything at that point. And then make sure you have people on standby. So IT, CSV resources, TMF operations for the eTMF, managing function for systems like IRT, EDC, anything you may have that's sort of outside of the eTMF. Somebody asked about interview skills, so I'm going to try to do this very quickly. They require a lot of practice. So be mindful of your body language, stay calm, be polite, be professional, answer clearly and concisely. Only answer what they ask. That's it. Don't give them more information. Consider how you approach open and closed questions. So, do you know what time it is? Yes, that's your answer. You know what time it is, right? So you don't want to go overboard. Ask for clarification if you don't understand the question. Always be truthful. Always refer to your SOPs where you can, and speak when spoken to. Definitely don't be aggressive, confrontational, or disrespectful to the inspector. Don't interrupt them, and don't start talking before they finish asking their questions. And never speculate, guess, make excuses, blame, any of that. The important part is if you don't know something, you just say, I don't know, but you can find out and you can come back to it, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And just remember that the inspector's just doing their job. Sometimes they come off a little tough, but they have an important job. They need to make sure that we're not, doing anything fraudulent or there's no scientific misconduct. So they have a pretty important role in doing that. And so they need to make sure they do that. And sometimes their, interview and behavioral things can kind of reflect that. All right. I'm not going to go into a lot of this. You probably heard it yesterday during the campus section. But at the end of the inspection, you'll have a debrief or closing meeting with the inspector, discuss any of the observations. At the time of the closing, FDA could could issue a 483. Others might give you verbal feedback, and then an inspection report shared with you according to the timelines of that agency. So categories, critical, major, minor, you've probably heard all of them. A bad inspection can have significant monetary, legal, and reputational damage and could lead to the rejection of your application. So it is like critically important that we try to avoid any critical or major findings. After the inspection has concluded, you want to make sure you review the scribe notes, the closeout meeting notes with each of your functional leads, and start to draft the response and begin your root cause analysis for any of those findings. And then you want to implement corrective and preventative actions for any of your critical or major findings, and review and respond within the timelines of that agency to the inspection commitments. Okay, and just last thing I'll say, inspections are great learning opportunities. Many people work at big companies and some never have the chance to go through an inspection. So feel happy, like lucky if you have been, because a lot of people don't really get the opportunity, and it's a great experience. And I always, it's silly and dorky, but I take a notepad with me in inspections and I write things down and I think, how can we do better next time? You know, so there's always stuff outside of like the observations you may get. You could say our process could be better here, or this is a gap. Track those things, action them, you know, make sure you share any lessons learned with people that need to communicate out any of those lessons learned. And just remember that challenges are just new opportunities for us. So it helps us process, improve, and get better in the future. So, geez, sorry. Thanks for letting me go over, Amit. I'm sorry.
No, of course. Can we get a huge round of applause for Christine? Emojis, sound off in the chat. That was an excellent presentation, and that's why we let you go over. I just want to quickly share some updates, Christina. Do you mind removing your slides from the bottom there? So yeah, Christina has promised to show up in the lounges, so I will invite you all to go spend the next 9 minutes there before the next session starting at 2. That session will be demystifying the TMF versus ISF debate from the site perspective. Super excited about that. So see you all back here in 9 minutes, but definitely check out the lounge. Christina's going to be there answering some questions. Super excited about that. It's going to be great. Meet new people, chill, have a good time, experience the virtual, not virtual world. It's really cool and ever evolving. And obviously, please fill out our survey for your chance to win some awesome, awesome Converse. Again, Christina, thank you so, so much. It was a pleasure watching.
Thank you. I'll see you guys in the lounge.